Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into this fat loss guide that I know you've been curious about. It's called Fat Loss Dying Made Simple. And well, it promises exactly that, simplicity. So let's break it down and see what it's all about.
Yeah, you know what I find interesting is how this guide really emphasizes food quality. It's not just about counting calories, you're really focusing on getting those calories from good sources.
Oh, so it's not just about like how much you eat, but what you eat.
Exactly. Yeah, and the guide really stresses choosing mostly unprocessed whole foods, not just for optimal nutrition, but also to help you feel fuller for longer.
That makes a lot of sense. So where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, the guide stresses that before you change anything, you need to know where you stand right now. That means tracking your current food intake.
Ah, so we're talking food scales, measuring cups.
Yeah, it might sound a little tedious, but it's crucial. It's like checking the foundation before you build a house, right? You need a clear picture of your starting point before you can create a plan that actually works for you,
They talk about tracking macros, right? Not just calories.
right? They break down protein, carbs, and fat. And why understanding your intake of each of these macros is so important. You wouldn't just dump a bunch of building materials on a site and hope for the best.
Right.
You got to know what you're working with and how it all fits together.
So that's where the simple part comes in. They give you a system to kind of figure out how much of each macro to eat.
Exactly. They recommend aiming for around 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day.
Okay, so if you weigh 150 pounds, that's 150 grams of protein daily. Sounds simple enough. But what about carbs and fats?
Well, they have specific guidelines for those too. They start with a minimum fat intake for hormonal balance, about 0.3 grams per pound of body weight. And then they have this formula for calculating your carb intake based on your total daily calories.
A formula? That sounds a little intimidating.
Don't worry, we won't make you do math on the fly or anything like that. The key takeaway here is that carbs kind of fill in the gaps after you hit your protein and fat targets. So you put the protein and fat pieces of the puzzle in place first, and then you use carbs to complete the picture.
Okay, yeah, that makes it a little less scary. So once you've got your macros figured out, what do you actually eat?
This is where the guide really shines. It offers so many examples of high-quality protein, carb, and fat sources, really emphasizing whole, unprocessed foods. For protein, they talk about lean meats, fish, eggs, even plant-based options like tofu and lentils.
And then for carbs, sticking with mostly veggies, fruits, and whole grains.
Exactly. It's all about getting those nutrient-dense carbs that provide sustained energy and keep you feeling full.
Makes sense. And what about fats? Are they focused on healthy, unsaturated fats like olive oil, avocados, nuts, and seeds?
Exactly. They do a really good job of explaining why these fats are not only good for your heart, but also important for hormone production and overall health. They even recommend incorporating some fatty fish like salmon and tuna a couple of times a week for those omega-3s.
So much good stuff. This guide really seems to focus on enjoying what you eat rather than being restrictive and, miserable while you're dieting.
Exactly. They acknowledge that the journey might be long. So finding ways to enjoy the process is key. It's not about eliminating food groups or just eating bland salads all day. They even provide some example meal plans to give you an idea of how to incorporate all of these delicious foods into your daily routine.
So we've got our food choices figured out, and our macros are all calculated. What's next?
Well, the next step is figuring out how to actually fit these macros into your daily meals. How often should you eat and when? Let's delve into that in the next segment.
Right, so we've talked about what to eat. Now let's talk about when to eat. Does this guy have any strong opinions on, meal timing and frequency?
It's actually more flexible than you might think. They point out that you can effectively lose fat eating just one meal per day.
Wait, just one? That sounds pretty extreme.
Yeah, it definitely goes against the conventional wisdom of like grazing throughout the day. But the guide emphasizes that as long as you're hitting your daily macro targets, meal frequency isn't really the most crucial factor.
So why do we hear so much about eating, multiple smaller meals?
Well, they do say there are some benefits to spreading your food intake throughout the day. For one thing, it can help manage hunger and keep your energy levels more stable. Plus, having protein spaced out can be beneficial for muscle growth and recovery.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially if you're working out a lot. I know I get pretty hangry if I go too long without eating.
Right. And they point out that consistent meal patterns are generally better than sporadic eating for both results and overall health. So whether you choose one meal, 3 meals, or something in between, consistency is really key.
So it's all about finding what works best for you and your lifestyle. But they do provide some guidelines, right, for those of us who do opt for multiple meals.
Oh yeah, they recommend eating within a couple of hours of waking up, having a post-workout meal within an hour of finishing your workout, and then spacing your meals out relatively evenly throughout the day.
Okay, so no need to be super rigid about it, but having some kind of structure is helpful.
Exactly. And they even provide a sample meal schedule with macro breakdowns for each meal. Just to give you an idea of what that might look like.
Okay, let's hear it. What does a typical day of eating look like according to Fat Loss Dieting Made Simple?
Let's say you're aiming for 2,000 calories per day. They suggest having breakfast with 40 grams of protein, 40 grams of carbs, and 20 grams of fat. So maybe something like eggs with whole grain toast and avocado, then a pre-workout snack with 35 grams of protein, 60 grams of carbs, and 10 grams of fat. A turkey sandwich on whole wheat bread with some fruit could work well there. Then, after your workout, they recommend a higher carb meal with 35 grams of protein, 90 grams of carbs, and 10 grams of fat. Think like pasta with lean ground beef and some veggies. And finally, a lighter meal before bed with 40 grams of protein, 25 grams of carbs, and 20 grams of fat. Greek yogurt with berries and a sprinkle of nuts would be a good option.
Okay, that sounds pretty doable and delicious. Not what I pictured when I thought of dieting. But speaking of dieting, there are a couple other important factors to consider, right? Like hydration and supplements.
Yeah, for sure. Let's start with hydration. This guide keeps it pretty simple. If your urine is clear or light yellow, you're good to go. They also suggest an extra glass of water or electrolyte drink before and after workouts, especially if you're sweating a lot.
Okay, so no need to obsess over exactly how many ounces you're drinking. Just listen to your body and stay hydrated. Now, what about supplements? Does this guide recommend a ton of fancy powders and pills?
Not at all. They really just focus on a handful of supplements that can be helpful. Specifically during a fat loss phase, whey and casein protein are great options, especially if you're finding it hard to hit your protein targets through food alone.
And they mention using whey protein around workouts and casein protein before bed, right? Because of the different absorption rates?
Exactly. Whey protein is quickly absorbed, making it perfect for post-workout recovery, while casein digests more slowly, providing a sustained release of amino acids throughout the night. They also suggest creatine, which can help preserve muscle mass when you're in a calorie deficit.
Okay, so just a few key supplements that can be helpful, but definitely not magic bullets by any means.
Exactly. They make it very clear that you can achieve great results with a solid diet and exercise plan, even without supplements. But speaking of results, we haven't really talked about the most important part of fat loss, creating a calorie deficit.
Right, we've laid the groundwork with food choices and meal timing, but now we have to talk about how to actually burn fat.
This is where the guide dives into the science of how fat loss actually works. It explains that when you consistently eat fewer calories than your body burns, it has to use stored fat for energy.
So you're basically forcing your body to use its own reserves.
Exactly. But they emphasize that this should be a gradual and sustainable process. Craft diets and extreme calorie cuts are a big no-no. They recommend aiming for a weight loss of about 0.5% of your body weight per week, at least for beginners, and then up to 1% for more experienced dieters.
So slow and steady wins the race.
Exactly. They compare it to learning to drive a race car. You wouldn't just hop in a Ferrari with no experience.
Right.
You'd start with a slow car, learn the basics, and then gradually increase your speed.
I like that analogy. Makes a lot of sense. So once you've set your weight loss goal, how do you actually figure out what your calorie deficit should be?
They provide a chart that shows, how different calorie deficits relate to potential weight loss per week. For example, a 500-calorie deficit should lead to about 1 pound of weight loss per week. They also offer a more precise formula for those who want to get really specific.
Okay, so we've got our target calorie deficit, but how do we actually make that happen? Can we just cut calories from anywhere?
They have a more strategic approach. They recommend aiming to achieve at least half of that deficit through increased activity. So rather than just drastically cutting your food intake, you try to incorporate more movement into your day. Take the stairs instead of the elevator. Walk during your lunch break. Go for a bike ride. Try a new fitness class. Things like that.
So it's not just about eating less, it's also about moving more.
Right. It's a much healthier and more sustainable approach. And if you still need to reduce calories after increasing your activity, they suggest making up the rest of the deficit by reducing your fat intake, but only down to that 0.3 grams per pound of body weight that we talked about earlier.
So fat is still important, even when you're trying to lose fat.
Oh, absolutely. It plays a crucial role in hormone health, energy production, and society. So definitely don't be afraid of healthy fats. Only as a last resort, if you still need to reduce calories further, would they recommend cutting carbs a little bit?
Okay, this is all making a lot more sense now. But even with a good plan and a calorie deficit, I imagine there are still some challenges along the way.
Oh yeah, for sure. Even with the best intentions, dieting can definitely throw some curveballs your way. And this guide actually acknowledges that. They dedicate an entire section to navigating those inevitable bumps in the road.
Okay, so let's talk about those challenges. What are some of the common roadblocks that people might run into when they're trying to lose fat? And how does this guide suggest overcoming them?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles, and this is something pretty much everyone can relate to, is hunger. It's like our bodies just naturally resist change, especially when it comes to eating less.
Yeah, it's like our brains go into survival mode. When we cut back on calories,
Exactly. The guide even uses the analogy of compressing a spring. The more you restrict your food intake, the harder that spring pushes back, leading to intense cravings and even potential binges.
okay, so how do we deal with that? Any strategies for managing those hunger pangs?
The guy offers some really practical advice. First, they recommend focusing on filling foods, things that are high in volume and fiber, but relatively low in calories, like veggies, fruits, lean proteins, even broth-based soups. These foods can help you feel physically full without overdoing it on calories.
So it's about choosing foods that are both satisfying and helpful for your goals.
Exactly. And it's not just about what you eat, but how you eat as well. They recommend eating slowly and mindfully, really savoring each bite. This allows your body to register that it's getting nourishment, which can help reduce those cravings.
That makes sense. It's easy to just mindlessly scarf down food when you're busy and then end up feeling unsatisfied and wanting more.
Right. They also talk about being mindful of overly tasty foods, like those super palatable, hyper-rewarding treats. Those can really hijack your brain's reward system and make it harder to stick to your plan.
So maybe save those for special occasions or when you're feeling a little less vulnerable to temptation.
Exactly. Now, another common challenge, besides hunger, is water weight fluctuations. It can be so frustrating to see the number on the scale go up, even when you're doing everything right.
Yeah, it's like the scale becomes your enemy.
Right. And the guide explains that those fluctuations are often just water retention, not actual fat gain. They point to a few different things that can cause water retention, like stress, high salt intake, and even artificial sweeteners.
It's not just about what we're eating, but other lifestyle factors that can affect our weight.
Exactly. They recommend managing stress through things like relaxation techniques, monitoring your salt intake, and being mindful of how many artificially sweetened drinks you're having.
So a pretty holistic approach.
Right. And then another challenge they address is what they call macro fitting, which is basically the struggle to find foods that fit into your macro targets for each meal and for the day overall.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been there. Trying to make all those protein, carb, and fat numbers add up can be tricky.
The guide has some great tips for making macro fitting easier. One of the best ones is to simplify your food choices. Instead of trying to use tons of different ingredients, pick a few go-to protein sources, carbs, fats, and veggies, and then build your meals around those.
So like a capsule wardrobe for your diet.
Exactly. It makes hitting your macros so much easier. They also recommend meal prepping whenever possible, so you have meals and snacks ready to go, especially during those busy times. It doesn't have to be super complicated. Just pre-chopping veggies or cooking a big batch of protein can make a big difference.
Those are some really helpful tips. So we've talked about the challenges, but what happens when you've actually achieved your fat loss goals? How do you maintain those results?
This is actually where I think the guide really stands out. They dedicate a whole section to the maintenance phase, which is often overlooked in other diet plans. It's not enough to just lose the weight. You have to have a plan to keep it off.
So you can't just go back to your old habits.
Definitely not. They warn against doing that, explaining that after you've been restricting calories for a while, your body goes through this kind of rebound effect, where it tries to regain that lost weight. They call it diet fatigue.
Diet fatigue.
Yeah. Imagine you're holding a beach ball underwater. When you let go, it's going to shoot right back up to the surface. It's kind of the same thing with diet fatigue. Your body has been deprived, and it wants to get back to how it was before.
So it's like our bodies are working against us, trying to pull us back to our old weight.
Right, and that's why they say that dieting doesn't just end when you reach your goal. You need a strategy for transitioning out of the fat loss phase and into a sustainable maintenance phase.
Okay, so what does that look like?
They have a 5-step process, starting with resisting the urge to immediately indulge in all the foods you've been avoiding.
So no victory pizza.
Not right away. They recommend sticking to your diet foods at first. While you slowly start to increase your calorie intake, they say to add back about 50% of your deficit on the first day of maintenance, focusing on healthy, nutrient-dense foods.
So you're kind of easing your body back into a higher calorie intake.
Exactly. And they say it's important to keep an eye on your weight during this transition. You might see a little increase from water retention, which is totally normal. But once your weight stabilizes, you can add back another 250 calories, again focusing on healthy choices.
Okay, so it's all about gradually increasing your calories and monitoring your weight until you find a level that allows you to maintain your results without feeling deprived.
Right. And then once you found that sweet spot, you can start to reintroduce some of those treats you've been missing.
Okay, that's what I wanted to hear. So pizza and ice cream are back on the menu.
Yeah. But the key here is moderation. They say to enjoy those treats within the context of a healthy lifestyle. So you're still mostly eating nutritious foods, staying active, and monitoring your weight.
So it's about balance.
Exactly. And they also say that this maintenance phase isn't a short-term thing. It can take several weeks for your weight to really stabilize after you start adding back those treats. So this phase can actually last for months. It's really about shifting from a restrictive mindset to a more sustainable way of life.
That makes a lot of sense. But what if one round of fat loss isn't enough? What if you have bigger weight loss goals?
The guide talks about that too. They acknowledge that you might need multiple fat loss phases, especially if you want to lose a significant amount of weight. But they caution against jumping right back into a calorie deficit after finishing a phase. They recommend giving yourself plenty of time to recover, both physically and mentally, before you start another fat loss phase,
So it's about cycling between periods of fat loss and maintenance.
right? And they say this approach is more sustainable and less likely to lead to burnout or rebound weight gain. For each new fat loss phase, they recommend lowering your weight loss goal percentage a little bit and gradually increasing the lengths of your maintenance phases.
So finding a rhythm that works for you.
Exactly. And they finish up by talking about something that's probably on a lot of people's minds, getting exotically lean.
Exotically lean, I haven't heard that term before.
Yeah, so they define it as achieving a very low body fat percentage, usually in the single digits for men and the low teens for women.
Oh, wow. That's like fitness model level leanness.
Right. And while it might be tempting to try and get that lean, they make it clear that it's not realistic or healthy for most people to maintain long term. It usually requires some pretty extreme calorie restrictions, and it can lead to some negative side effects like intense hunger, cravings, low energy, even hormonal issue.
So it's important to consider all of that before you go down that road.
Definitely. And even if you do decide to try and get that lean, they say it's super important to do it safely. Work with an experienced coach and have a plan for how you're going to regain some weight afterwards.
So it's not just about getting lean, it's about doing it in a way that's healthy and sustainable.
Exactly. This guide really emphasizes that fat loss is a journey, not a destination. It's about making changes that you can stick with for the long haul.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today, from the basics of macros and food choices to the challenges of dieting and creating a plan for keeping the weight off for good.
Yeah, Fat Loss Dieting Made Simple definitely lives up to its name. It's a really clear, comprehensive, and surprisingly approachable guide for anyone who wants to improve their body composition and their overall health.
What stood out to you the most from this deep dive? Anything that surprised you or challenged your thinking about fat loss?
I was really impressed by how much they emphasized sustainability. The long game. It's not about quick fixes or crazy restriction. It's about building healthy habits that you can actually maintain.
Yeah, they do a great job of debunking some of those common diet myths.
Absolutely. They also stress the importance of finding what works for you individually, listening to your body, and focusing on both your physical and mental well-being,
Great takeaways.
for sure.
Well, that concludes our deep dive into fat loss dieting made simple. We hope you found it helpful and informative. Remember, consistency and patience are key, and finding what works for you is crucial. Until next time, happy dieting!